In Allah's Torch, Tracy Dahlby looks at Asia's war on terror and growing separatist movements in Indonesia. This event from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. is an hour 10 minutes.
Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to this special book talk, book launch. I'm Mike Mochizuki, the Director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies here at the Elliott School at George Washington University. Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, is frequently viewed as the second front in the global war against terrorism. Unfortunately, all too often, Islamic fundamentalism, political separatism, and global terrorism get conflated in discussions about Southeast Asia and the so-called global war against terrorism. President Bush encouraged this simplistic view when he declared in black and white terms that either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. To help correct such a simplistic perspective, at least about Indonesia, Tracy Dahlby has recently published a book entitled Allah's Torch, a report from behind the scenes in Asia's war on terror. This book draws upon first-hand observations and conversations in parts of Indonesia where Western journalists or scholars seldom venture. I found the book to be riveting as well as balanced and insightful. Tracy Dahlby is one of the most respected and experienced journalists writing about Asia today. He spent 13 years living in Asia, where he served as Tokyo Bureau Chief for Newsweek and the Washington Post, respectively, and has covered events in Japan, China, Korea, and throughout Southeast Asia. In 1987, he became Managing Director of Newsweek International in New York, where he directed and coordinated worldwide news coverage. More recently, he's been a regular contributor to National Geographic magazine, for which he has written on major developments in Japan, China, the South China Sea region, and Vietnam. And his work on Indonesia's dramatic political and social transformation appeared in March in the March 2001 edition, and is featured in The World of Islam, a book published by the National Geographic Society. Tracy also is an award-winning filmmaker, serving as director and/or producer for many acclaimed television series, such as The 50s, The Pacific Century, and Sports Century. He graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle with a BA in History, a summa cum laude, and then he received his master's in East Asian Studies from Harvard University. And he has also been a research fellow at the University of Tokyo Faculty of Law. He started his journalistic career writing first for the AP Dow Jones Economic Report in Tokyo, and he was Tokyo correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review. And I'm also personally delighted to welcome him to George Washington University because we were classmates at Harvard. And we've been friends for the last 30 years, but please don't hold that against him. So Tracy, welcome, and we look forward to hearing about Indonesia.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Mike. I think Mike was one of the reasons that I was able to graduate from my program at Harvard. He kind of kept me together, mind and spirit, and I've always been very grateful for his friendship. Going around promoting one of these books provides a variety of interesting experiences. I had one the other morning when I was on a morning news talk show. And just before we went to air, the anchor, he was a very nice guy, intelligent guy. I mean, it was like 6:45 in the morning, you know, so he was a lot nicer and more intelligent than I was. And he turned to me and he said, tell me, Tracy, how many terrorists do you think we took out with that tsunami? You know, it was a stunning question, particularly at 6:45 in the morning. And he was perfectly sincere about it. And the first thing that went through my head was, what did he mean, we? It was almost as if he thought he was implying that that the tsunami was some new anti-terrorist device that we had decided to wield in the war against terror. The second thing that went through my head was, what did he mean by terrorist? And because as far as I knew, there were no terrorists in Aceh province, which is the area in Indonesia which was most hard hit by the tsunami. At that time, 100,000 people were dead in that area, Indonesians. And yet, it was instructive because, as Mike suggested in his introduction, the difference between a separatist and a terrorist in our world of intense media focus often disappears. This was a case where it was an honest mistake on his part, but it belied the complexity of the situation. And of course, in Aceh, there has been a long-running, long-simmering civil war for 30 years between the Achenese insurgents and the Indonesian military. But the insurgents are separatists, they're not terrorists. So this is one of the problems that I think we run into in this age where the media focus we become so narrowly focused on this issue of terrorism. Who are the terrorists? Where are they? The drive of the media is so intense that it sort of drives out some of the other issues that we need to consider. The coverage of the tsunami was a great example of how modern media technology can help us, can really provide the first supply, an essential part of the journalistic endeavor, and that is to take people to places where they cannot go and allow them to see things they cannot otherwise see. The way in which TV fails us a bit, and of course I can say this because I've worked in television, is in providing context and giving us an understanding of what it is we're seeing and what are the implications going forward. And in Aceh, I think what you have is not a situation of terrorism, but a very delicate and terrifyingly difficult situation. And by that I mean that the long-running civil war in Aceh has really been now the problem between the military and the separatists has been aggravated again by not a man-made disaster, but by a natural disaster. The military, the Indonesian military, is really one of the major problems in Aceh. In the last 20 years or so, it's estimated that about 12,000 people have died in the insurgency in Aceh, about 90% of those attributed to the government forces. And yet the Free Aceh movement, GAM, has not exactly led an exemplary life either. The military has been involved in turning Aceh into something of a fiefdom. They've been involved in illegal logging and smuggling and extortion. GAM has helped pave its way by being involved in drug trafficking and illegal forms of taxation against local villages and so forth. So what you have is a situation where the chaos, again, is stirred up by, this time, a natural disaster. And of course, chaos can breed the conditions which encourage terrorism, ultimately. So there is an indirect connection, even though you cannot argue that terrorists are a major factor in Aceh, but you can argue that it's the kind of situation that if it's not brought to some kind of peaceful resolution, could lead to a situation where it could encourage tensions not only in Aceh but across the country that would favor the growth and breeding of terrorism. But I'd like to explain a little bit about, I think it's important to understand the Indonesian context, and that's really why I wrote the book. You know, the old politicians used to say that all politics are local, and to a certain degree, I think that all terrorism is local too. Often we look at terrorism as being something like maybe a Harvard Business School organizational chart with Osama bin Laden as the CEO at the top and all kinds of profit centers kind of scattered out across the globe. I prefer to think of terrorism, after having spent some time in Indonesia and Southeast Asia looking at the question, I prefer to think of it more as a Jackson Pollock painting with these sort of energized circles kind of moving across the canvas, coming together or separating as their own interests dictate. They may all, to a certain degree, subscribe to the theory of a worldwide Islamic revolution or regional Islamic revolution, but in many cases they're really responding to local conditions, the lack of jobs, the lack of medical care, the lack of a sense of getting a fair shake in the courts or with the police. And so looking at the sort of panorama of Indonesia and considering that at least it's worth making the argument that terrorism is bred in localities and is not sort of dictated from the top, I decided to look at sort of the broad swath of the country of Indonesia. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how I got into the story. I did not go to Indonesia looking specifically at the problem of resurgent militant Islam. I went to Indonesia in November of 1999 because the National Geographic magazine asked me to go and look at a very geographical question. Suharto, who had ruled the country with an iron hand for 32 years, his government had fallen in May of 1998. And Indonesia, I think it's fair to say, was in something of an uproar. You had all kinds of conflicts, communal, religious, going on all over the country. The most apparent phenomenon was the sort of uprush of democratic fervor. You had people wanting, after the long reign of Suharto, to create their own democracy, so the so-called reformasi movement. And of course, one of the points of confusion was that democracy really meant anything you wanted it to mean, anytime you wanted it to mean it. It was a very liquid and fluid concept. So you had the forces of democracy, and you had all kinds of other things coming out of the woodwork at the same time. As I say in the book, peril was fighting with promise on almost every street corner and in almost every region of Indonesia. I went to Aceh in 2000, which was rather a scary place at that time. There weren't a lot of foreign reporters there, and the situation was very bleak. I mean, you got the sense that the military was not in control, and the separatists weren't in control, and in fact there was nobody who was really in control. And in between you had kind of a free-floating group of thugs and hangers-on and gangster types who were carrying out extortion against local non-governmental organizations. It was really kind of a rough situation. You went to an island like Sulawesi. I mean, Aceh wasn't the only place where they had a separatist issue. You went to an island like Sulawesi, the one that looks like sort of the jigsaw, a piece of a jigsaw puzzle on steroids, a very interesting looking island. And I went to Makassar, the main city at the southwestern tip. And I asked my local contact, I said, well, I'd like to meet the separatists. And he said, well, which separatists would you like to meet? There are 5 groups. I think we wound up talking to 3 of them. We went to Borneo, Kalimantan, as the Indonesians call it. And the indigenous Dayaks were fighting the Maoris, the group of settlers that Suharto had sent in over a course of many years to help in the economic development of the Borneo frontier. At the point we went in, the army had decided to side with the Maoris, and the police had decided to side with the Dayaks, and the army and the police were shooting at one another. So it was a very confusing situation. And all of this was happening in a very pivotal country. I mean, I don't need to recite the facts for a group like this, but Indonesia is a huge country. I didn't realize how huge it was until I started trying to travel around from point to point. You know, it covers an area that's equal to the distance from Ketchikan, Alaska to Key West, Florida. I mean, it's enormous, 3,200 miles from stem to stern, 238 million people, 5 major religions. It is the world's largest Islamic country. And so there's a lot going on there. It's pivotal for another reason, because it is sort of the linchpin of Southeast Asia. It's Southeast Asia's largest economy. The 3 major shipping routes in the area pass through Indonesia, shipping routes that carry 50% of the world's seaborne commercial cargo. So big trouble in Indonesia essentially means big trouble for the global economy. And yet, the country is so diverse that I thought the only way that I could hope to cover it, I mean, the National Geographic is a very generous employer. And whereas working for a news magazine, working for Newsweek, I was used to covering a story in a couple of days or a week at most. The Geographic will give you months, but they won't give you years. So I had to try to figure out how to cover the story in a fairly short amount of time. And I decided that the best way to do it was to do it like a seismologist might study a newly discovered earthquake zone. I mean, you would go to the places where the conflict was most intense and sort of take a snapshot of that area. And then you'd go to the next area. And at the end of the day, you'd hope that your snapshots could be assembled into some kind of group portrait that could give you a sense of where the country was and where it might be going. The first thing that I discovered that for a 50-year-old, then 50-year-old reporter with bad basketball knees, I mean, this was a very grueling assignment. And one of the smart things, maybe the only smart thing I did, was to hire an Indonesian guide, the inimitable Norman Wibowo, who became my guide and friend throughout several years of travel in Indonesia. And Norman was a very shrewd judge of human nature. It didn't take him long to size me up. And he suggested, he said, boss, I think it's time for a vacation. I think we'd only been traveling around Indonesia for about a month, and I said, no vacation. We've got to keep on this story and keep hitting it hard. And he said, well, and this is where Indonesian diplomacy comes in. He said, well, I didn't really mean vacation. I meant kind of a working vacation. And what he was suggesting was that we go to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, that sort of California-sized archipelago that rests in the watery gut of eastern Indonesia, about 1,600 miles east of the capital of Jakarta. And I said, well, why would we? It seems like out of the way. I mean, why would we go way out there? And he said, well, you don't understand. That's where we will see Indonesian history in a nutmeg shell. He was a very good phrase maker, Norman. And of course, the Spice Islands were called the Spice Islands because in the 16th and 17th century, they were a focal point of the global economy of those days. They were the focal point because that was the only place on Earth where nutmeg was known to grow, and nutmeg at that point happened to be a very hot commodity in Europe. It did a couple of things. It actually did a couple of things that it was purported to do. It prevented meat from rotting, and it gave a nice taste to a lot of bland European dishes. It also didn't do other things that it was supposed to do. It was considered sort of a medieval form of Viagra. It was also considered a prophylactic against the Black Death, which had fairly recently wiped out a third of Europe's population. So in an age 300 years before miracle drugs were invented, nutmeg, strangely enough, to think today, was considered the miracle drug of the 16th and 17th century. And because it sold on a par in Europe just below gold and silver. I mean, the spice chasers would go to Indonesia, or what would become Indonesia. They would buy nutmeg, fill the holds of their ships, go back to Europe, where they could sell it at 30,000 to 60,000% of the purchase price in the Spice Islands. So with profits that big at stake, I mean, you know what happened. England and Holland particularly got into a ferocious spice war as they tried to, each side vied to monopolize the spice trade. The British held the most prolific nutmeg island of them all, and it was an island called Rouen in the Banda Islands. So after fighting back and forth, a pragmatic solution was arrived at. Diplomacy was at work, and a real estate deal was suggested. And the deal that was suggested was that, and this was under the Treaty of Breda in 1667, and the deal that was suggested was that the British would give up the nutmeg factory on Rouen, give up the island, for a Dutch holding in the northern hemisphere, and a chillier part of the world, a piece of real estate called Manhattan. Now, when Norman told me this, I said, no, you got to be pulling my leg. And in fact, a fellow named Giles Milton was, unbeknownst to me at that time, writing a very nice book called Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which tells this story in great detail. But Norman said, no, this is why I say, this is Indonesian history in a nutmeg shell, so we've got to go. Sometimes Norman was not all that good on the details, though. And what he failed to tell me was that in order to get to the Nutmeg Islands, we would have to travel through a war zone. And there was a very brutal war going on at that moment in the Spice Islands, in the Moluccas, pitting the Christians against the Muslims. After Suharto fell, all hell had suddenly broken loose in January of 1999. And by the time Norman and I got into the territory, anywhere between 3,000 and 30,000 people were dead in the fighting. And the population there is about 2 million, roughly split between Muslims and Christians. There were 500,000 people running for their lives, looking for sanctuary. I mean, that's the size of Portland, Oregon. So the islands were in turmoil. People, if you took one of the island ships as we did, there were refugees everywhere. Another instance of almost complete chaos. And so it was that Norman and I returned to the storied spice port of Makassar, gateway to the Spice Islands, and one night we got on a ship bound to take us in to see the nutmeg. And we wound up getting on the same ship with 600 jihadis from a newly formed militant group called the Laskar Jihad, or Holy War Army. Now, Norman and I were going to see the nutmeg. The Laskar Jihad were going to have holy war with the Christians in Ambon, which was the regional hub. Now, I might be a phobic person by nature, I don't know, but this seemed to be something I should be concerned about as the only non-Indonesian on this ship with the 600 Laskar Jihad. I'm not a very good swimmer, but I was giving serious thought to jumping over the side of the ship before we got too far out and trying to dog paddle back to the dock. But Norman, being Indonesian and being very persuasive, he said, boss, we've got to go. He said, this is the only way you're going to see the real Indonesia. And I said, Norman, that's what I'm afraid of. I didn't really mean that, but you know, it was a low moment being on the ship with the Lascar Jihad. Norman had grasped a first principle of journalism, which I conveniently wanted to forget, and that was simply, if you don't go, you'll never know. I was concerned about, you know, you meet friends and you like and admire them, and I was mostly concerned about, you know, coming off as the great white chicken in Norman's eyes. So we stayed on the ship, and we went into the Spice Islands, and of course Norman was perfectly right, as he usually was. What we saw there was not only the history of the Nutmeg Islands, but we also saw something which struck me as being important, and that was how a micro-war in our globalized world, a war which, like the one in the Spice Islands, starts far from geopolitical borders of any consequence to the United States or Europe, is lightly reported in the Western media, and yet becomes a problem, ultimately becomes a problem for the rest of the world. The way that happened in the case of the Spice Islands is that you know, there had long been tensions there, even before the Dutch arrived. The Dutch arrived and sort of aggravated the situation, if I can, you know, put history in a nutmeg shell, by adopting this divide and conquer strategy. They would arm two sides in a conflict and let them fight it out. And you know, I think the theory was it was better that the indigenous population fight one another than fight the Dutch. It was what Norman Mailer called the old colonialist trick of, you know, let the madmen duke it out and jump the one or two who are left. That was sort of the theory. So these teapot struggles continued there for centuries, even after the Dutch were shown the door, after the Indonesians won their independence in 1949. And under Sukarno and then Suharto, the authoritarian figures who controlled the country until Suharto's demise in 1998, the lid was kept on pretty tight. In 1999, something different started to happen, and that was you had people coming from the outside pushing the militant Islamic agenda in the Spice Islands. You had Christian groups coming in from the outside pushing their agenda. So you had this outside influence coming in. Soon there were DVDs and videotapes circulating throughout the mosques in Southeast Asia of Christian atrocities, and there were Christian atrocities. There were Muslim atrocities as well. And these tapes were used as a recruiting tool to get you know, intense young men from around the region to join the jihad, the glorious jihad in the Spice Islands. The Christians circulated their own DVDs and videos. The Muslims turned out to be much better video distributors. They had a better network, and so they were more effective in getting their message across. So suddenly, as one Indonesian friend put it, he said, you know, the crisis in the Moluccas had not only gone Hollywood, it had gone cosmic at the same time. And it had gone cosmic in the sense that now one of these sort of traditional struggles with the outside influence and with the modern communications technology had now become, in many people's minds, the final showdown between good and evil. The result was, as I said, a chaos which was largely ignored by the outside world. And this was 16 months, roughly, when we were there before 9/11. Actually, if I could borrow your book, I want to read just a passage which I think sort of sums up the situation in the Moluccas at the time that Norman and I were just getting ready to make our escape. In all the chaos, one particularly portentous event went virtually unnoticed. 2 months after our hairy ride through the Moluccas, a man named Omar al-Farouk later arrested by the CIA as al-Qaeda's senior operative in Indonesia, took Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's top lieutenant, on a tour of the embattled Moluccas, allegedly scouting a site for a terrorist camp. It remains unclear whether or how many of those camps were ever set up. But the larger point is really this. Terrorism loves what the diplomats call a nuisance conflict. And while infighting among the militant groups involved in the Eastern campaign would eventually splinter the effort, opening the way for the signing of a peace accord, the Moluccas had given terrorism in Indonesia a frightening new impetus. In fact, the struggle there had become to the development of terrorism in Southeast Asia what the fighting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had been to al-Qaeda a decade earlier, the great catalytic event for a new generation of holy warriors, blooded in fighting, inculcated with a romantic overarching vision of the world Islamic revolution, and bonded to large numbers of like-minded comrades from across the region. Emboldened jihadis would soon bring bloody chaos to Bali and then into the heart of downtown Jakarta, and in so doing, toss up a whole new cast of characters for terrorism detectives in the US and Asia to follow. The question remained, although there were terrorists in Indonesia, the question remained, where did they fit in this larger puzzle that I was talking about with all the positive and negative forces swirling around? That was a question in the spring of 2000 that I was just as happy to leave behind. I had my story for National Geographic. We had traveled into the Nutmeg Islands and gotten out, and I was just as happy to go home to my home in Manhattan, where it was safe, and I was really not interested in going back to Indonesia anytime soon while the situation remained so unsettled. But never say never. 9/11, times change. 9/11, the attack on Manhattan and Washington, the attack on Bali a year later in October 2000. I mean, I, as many people did, I took it quite personally. I mean, I felt as if I had been attacked in my front yard, and now also having spent 30 years reporting from Asia, attacked in my backyard too. So I decided to go back and try to look at this question of the Muslim landscape and look at it more closely now, and to try to determine the extent to which, how big a role was played by the extremists, how big a role was played by, and you look at it in terms of concentric circles, how big a role was played by the extremists who really are a minority of a minority, how big a role was played by the growing number of fundamentalists, and what ripple effects that had on the much larger moderate Muslim population. So I think we're running a little bit low on time. Let me just suffice it to say that a couple of curious things happened. One, a new group had suddenly popped on the radar screen, and this was not Laskar Jihad, this was Jamaah Islamiyah. In December of 2001, Singaporean internal security busted up a plot by JI that was alleged to have plans to blow up 4 embassies in Singapore, US, British, Australian, Israeli. There were a number of 3 or 4 parts to the plan. One of the more extravagant plans was to hijack a jumbo jet at Changi Airport in Singapore, fly it around the control tower, come back in and crash it into the airport building. So there were good reasons to be concerned. And there were good reasons for police work to get activated in a very serious way. I think one of the things that we tended to overlook in our narrow focus, I mean, almost overnight, Indonesia, which the media had largely ignored since we sort of let it be after Suharto, everything, Indonesia seemed to be this game of struggling democracy. things seemed to be on track. After the Suharto situation died down, there was relatively little press coverage. After 9/11, the focus went back to Indonesia as George Bush proclaimed it the area, the important second front on the war on terror. And he was talking about Indonesia specifically, but also, of course, the general area. And I think, so one of the interesting things that happened was that as we were changing our view of Indonesia, struggling democracy, now den of terrorism, the Indonesians were radically changing their view of us. In 2000, there was a poll done by the Pew Research Group, and they asked Indonesians, do you like the United States? I mean, essentially that was the question. 75% of Indonesians said, yes, we like the United States. I mean, you know, these people were on our side. The same question was asked of Canadians, and only 72% of Canadians said that they liked the United States. 3 years later, after Afghanistan, after the invasion of Iraq by the United States, the number was 15%, where it roughly remains today. So you had this dramatic reversal. And I was talking to somebody about this in the context of the book, and they said, oh, well, yes, that means that all those people over there hate us. Well, I strongly disagree with that. And I think anytime you have that big a flip-flop in that short a time, you have to be quite suspicious of what's behind it. I prefer to think that the Indonesians have what I call in the book a hibernating regard for the United States. I think there was immediate anger in many camps over, well, which stemmed essentially from what might be called a modified Al Jazeera effect. You know, what Indonesians were seeing on their television was not what we were seeing on CNN. They weren't seeing intrepid Americans going in to liberate Afghanistan. They were seeing the collateral damage caused by American bombs and the killing and wounding of innocent Muslim women and children. So there was a difference in perspective and therefore, in that case, an honest difference in views. I say this because it's sort of leading up to my final point, which is that if we're going to be successful in dealing with Islamic fundamentalism in a place like Indonesia, I think we have to be very careful about making better efforts in the battle and the struggle for hearts and minds than we have so far, as we've taken this very narrow focus on tracking the terrorists themselves. Time and time again during my second period there after 9/11, I talked to people from all across the Muslim spectrum, from people on left-wing Muslim parties, political parties, to very moderate Muslim leaders, to people on the other, the more radical extreme. And they would say without qualification that the United States is now simply a country that does not listen to us. Sometimes it was hard for me to get a word in edgewise in these conversations, so I became an American who listened. And as a result, I heard some interesting things. But I think one of the things that we have to be very conscious of is to address the issues of what I call the great moderate Muslim middle. Our popularity rating may have gone down, but the issue there really is the struggle that's going on all throughout Asia for the soul of Islam. This is how the Indonesians characterize it. On the one hand, you have moderates who basically share, religions may be different, but they basically share our values, democratic values, reproductive rights, gender rights, accommodation with the West. And then you have on the other side conservative or fundamentalist Muslims, decent, nonviolent people, but people who feel that the social ills are so deep that the only real effective answer is to impose Islamic law, Sharia law, and just sort of clean out the corruption and the problems that way. And so I think ultimately, if we are to prevail, what we need to do is what the Indonesians tell us we need to do, which is to help them strengthen their natural immune defenses. One fellow I talked to said, we've been struggling against radical Islam for 80 years. Where were you all that time? We have, carried on the debate and, when necessary, the struggle and the fight. So what I think we need to really focus on, and I hope my book strengthens the argument for this point, is that we need to help strengthen the moderates through our efforts. And of course, in that regard, aid for education is very important. Help in improving the courts, systems of training judges, and all of those things, which really get back to a central issue, which is social justice, and the feeling in Indonesia among many people that they simply can't get a fair shake no matter what they do. So I think that needs to be more of our focus, and of course that's why the tsunami crisis, in a horrible way, may have some good come out of it. Yet, if it gets us back re-engaged in the region in a positive way, in order for that to happen, we have to stay there. We have to stick it out. Now that the tsunami has almost ceased completely to be a media story, there's less pressure on policymakers to make good on our pledges, and frankly, our track record isn't all that great in many cases. So we really need to not only do the right thing in the short term, which I think we're doing, but to do it in the medium and the long term. So let me conclude my remarks there. I'd be happy to talk about the situation in Aceh a little bit more if you're interested in the course of our discussion. But thank you for listening. Thank you for being Americans who listen.
Please go ahead and raise your hands if you have questions.
Yes, sir.
My name is Nico. I'm from the LA School. When you talked about helping with education, what sort of things do you see? I mean, could the U.S. be suspected of trying to infiltrate sort of propaganda of a policy that is not necessarily the truth, or sort of suspicion of this? How would you avoid that?
I think that goes with the turf, and I'm not sure how I would avoid it, except that I think there are enough Indonesians, moderate Indonesians, who feel that a brainy effort on America's part to help in something where the need is so great as education. And again, maybe this is an area where we can let the Indonesians run interference for us, provided that we don't try to take too demonstrative a role. Now, George Bush, when he was in Bali last year, I guess it was 2003, he pledged $157 million in aid to Indonesian education. Now, people like Ed Masters, who was responsible for the U.S.-Indonesia Commission doing a wonderful report, I think it came out last year. I think Ed Masters has said in testimony in Congress that $157 million is a good start, but it's still too low. And then, of course, we have the question of whether the $157 million will ever get into the pipeline. So, in answer to your question, I'm not quite sure how we go about it. In part, we're always going to face those criticisms, but I think this is an area where it's a productive area for a partnership with thoughtful Indonesians, and heaven knows there are a lot of them. And I think together, we just have to sort of overcome that hurdle, charges of bias and propaganda, and let good work speak for themselves. Yes, sir.
My name's Ravi. I'm a student here at the Elliott School. Given that Islam came to Southeast Asia by relatively peaceful means,
Right.
This recent radicalization is something that happened in the last 10 years. I mean, like the quest for independence was never about religion. It was more about democracy. It was nationalistic. What causes radicalization of Islam in Southeast Asia? Was it the repression of the Suharto era, or were there external factors? Like, was Afghanistan an issue, or, your thoughts on that, please?
It's a good question. I think the external factors came later. And that's why I spend the first half of the book talking about the situation in the Moluccas, because to me it's sort of emblematic. Now you have the same thing happening in Iraq under different circumstances, where something that's, I mean, the Moluccas was a micro war. What's going on in Iraq is maybe something different. But still, these conflicts that provide, you know, a great draw for young people who are interested in joining the jihad. In Islam, I'm not an Islamic scholar, obviously, but my understanding is that Islam did come to Indonesia in a fairly peaceable form. Aceh was called the front porch of Mecca because that's where the traders first arrived in Indonesia from the Middle East. I think a lot of it had to do with this question of social injustice. I mean, there are different kinds of terrorism. And state-sponsored terrorism under the Suharto regime, I think, was one of the reasons that we're dealing with this problem of radical Islam today. You know, Suharto not only kept the pro-democracy forces under thumb, he also kept Islamic forces under his thumb. Abu Bakr Bashir, the leader of JI, you know, was arrested, jailed, went into exile, and all of that sort of courtesy of the Suharto regime. Suharto never developed a way for dealing with. He simply wanted to suppress fundamentalist Islam because he saw it as a problem. So there was no way of having a sort of honest debate about the future directions of Islam under Suharto. And I think that was part of the problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Dale Barnhart, and I was just walking down the street, really. That's why I'm here. Anyway, what I wanted to, what it seemed to me from my experience with Indonesia is that we were getting slammed for things that we were trying to do, especially Congress, as far as restricting aid to the Indonesian military.
Right.
And so the Indonesian militarists and that bureaucracy was angry with us. On the other hand, we weren't getting any credit from the public in Indonesia for that. And to the extent that we had any influence or say in East Timor, right? That was one thing. Another thing is I was directly involved in the sale of some F-5s about 13 years ago that the U.S. decided to not sell to Indonesia. And that was an interesting story where they said, look, you guys, human rights record is so abysmal that we can't do this. And so the transfer of those from Jordan to Indonesia at the time didn't occur. And so, you know, there was lots of things that, particularly in Congress, you know, did not allow things on the basis that they had a bad human rights record. And on the other hand, if you're going to go and try to address the people's problems in Aceh, this tsunami thing allowed us pretty much free entree to get supplies and stuff in there. But do you cooperate with the national government and to work with them? Because to a certain extent, if you're effective, you make them look bad. You know, so it seems like there's a host of contradictions swirling in all this.
Well, let me see if I can jump into the maelstrom and make any sense out of that. I mean, it's a good question, and there's a lot going on, but it is confusing at times. I think Aceh is a good example where you have Americans going in and foreign aid workers coming in. And I was doing a lot of these TV programs simply because the geography of the book happened to coincide with the geography of the tsunami. And there was a lot of irritation on the part of people that I was interviewed by or people I was teamed up with on TV. Irritation at the point like, well, who's the Indonesian military to tell us that we got to be out of Indonesia by March 26th? You know, where do they get off doing that? And I have to try to explain that, you know, this issue of having Caucasian soldiers from a foreign power on the ground in Indonesia that had been a colony of the Dutch for 400 years, you know, that was a problem. There was an issue of national sovereignty that I thought the U.S. Military, for once, well, I mean, the military, I think, always does a pretty good job, but the tone was right. I mean, we were in there in a supportive capacity. We didn't try to go in and say, step aside, son, we're going to show you how to do this. The problem is that I think a lot of our coverage did not sort of show us what was going on behind the scenes. And of course, the military, as I said earlier, has been a major problem in Aceh because they have set the place up like a fiefdom. I'm not exactly sure. The New York Times this morning announced that, reported that the Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, had announced peace talks would take place in Helsinki between the Indonesian government and the insurgents. You know, I'm not sure that the military, which plays such a strong role in Aceh as it does elsewhere in Indonesia, you know, whether peace is really in their interest. I mean, the question really is the military going to give up such a lucrative foothold in Aceh, and what are they going to get in return?
They just increased or approved some funding. I mean, I think you have to bring the military into, give it some status and stake in the civil society, more than it being this independent.
Well, that's a good point. And simultaneously, he upped the estimate for the defense budget. So there's some kind of trade-off going on there. And I think that's, you know, it's very much a place on the political edge, which I don't think was coming through in the reporting, because how are these deals going to go down? And there's a lot of deal making that needs to be done. And I think, you know, that's the drama, the political drama that's going to unfold in the months to come. Because if the military manages to discredit the central government, that could open up, you know, not only chaos in Aceh, but chaos again in the Moluccas, chaos in other parts of Indonesia, if people get the sense that the central government really isn't, you know, that the anchor isn't holding. Yes, sir.
Gene Martin with U.S. Institute of Peace. I was just going to say you've touched on two of the key issues, and that is the lack of justice. And I think that what's happened is the reaction against the corruption, not only in the military, but throughout the government, particularly in the previous regime, I think has made the people become much more, how should we say, concerned about values. And you mentioned earlier that Islamic values and Western values are very much the same. And I think they've clung to or returned to Islam to be able to re-establish their connection with values, and I think against corruption. That was a big issue in the last election, of course.
I think that's a very good way to put it.
And I think, my question is whether you think Yudhoyono, as a military officer, has a chance to maybe do something with the TNI.
As I suggested earlier, I'm not really sure, but there are a couple of disturbing things that have come up, you know, as I've kind of been on the internet with Indonesian friends. And I think that after Megawati, whose government did continue suffering with the corruption problem, and Megawati did not always seem as if she was in command, and therefore there was a lot of chaos within her administration. I think there was high hopes riding on SBY, as they call him, you know, the Indonesian JFK, SBY. And by all accounts, you know, he's a competent and decent fellow. But the other element in his character was discussed in some of these internet conversations, and the fact that he neither may be the most decisive character on the face of the earth. And the extent to which he can openly challenge the military is another question. Whether some of these bromides that he's offered the military, whether that will be enough. I mean, I simply think this is a drama that's going to play out. I know that there was a lot of disappointment over the slowness of the SBY government to mount the relief effort in Aceh. And people were saying, you know, not where is Osama, or where are the Saudis? They were saying, you know, where in the heck is the Jakarta government? And particularly, where is the United States? Well, the United States showed up and sort of put some discipline along with the other foreign aid workers into the effort. And then, the military kind of got with the program and things got organized. But I think it's going to be, this is the kind of story that television really isn't very well equipped to deal with, because this is the story that's going to be unfolding.
I have a question. Before the 9/11 and the Bali bombing, the big crisis in that part of the world that people talked about was the 1997 East Asian economic crisis.
Right.
And in the wake of that, and one good thing was the fall of Suharto and the democratization of Indonesia, but also there's the critical side because of IMF financial discipline measures, the kind of social dislocation that the crisis caused in Indonesia was particularly severe. So I was wondering to what extent the crisis has mattered at all in kind of providing more fertile ground for a more extreme or fundamentalist Islamic perspective rather than the moderate one.
Yeah, it's this whole question of the tipping point.
Right.
Does Indonesia become, a fundamentally dysfunctional country, or is there another future that's possible for it? I think that's an excellent question. Aceh is interesting in that regard. I was thinking about this morning. The chaos there sort of opens the door. It has opened the door to some radical groups. And this, of course, is what the press picked up on in the last couple of weeks. The group that I start the book with, start with a rather uncomfortable visit to the leader of the Islamic Defenders Front in Jakarta. I don't want to give away the book, but that ended, by the way, there's a chapter later on where I pick up that conversation where I go in with great trepidation, and he ends up giving me a bit of a tongue lashing, but then because I was an American who listened, he said, "You should be President of the United States. You're an American who listens." So this is the old journalistic rule that you go into a story expecting one thing and being quite surprised by the outcome. But his group set up operations in Banda Aceh. A group called the Laskar Mujahideen set up operations. Hizb ut-Tahrir, another group, set up operations. And I was getting questions like, well, are our soldiers safe? Will the aid workers be in danger? And I think really what was involved there was what you might call outreach competition. These groups wanted to be able to get their oar in the water. I think partly on the theory that if the Americans cut and run, as they would be normally expected to do by, in their mentality, that they would open up a vacuum that these groups could then exploit. But the chaos also, interestingly enough, opened up the possibility for NGOs and human rights groups to go back into Aceh, and they had been virtually banned. Aceh had been under martial law for 3 or 4 years. So it allowed some of these more progressive groups, more committed to democratic values, to go back into Aceh. And that's one of the reasons I think that the military wanted everybody out, because they didn't want people going back into villages in the countryside and coming back with reports of the fighting between the rebels and the military. So I think the chaos sort of opens up both possibilities, and that's another, it's another situation where this story is going to unfold. It needs to be closely watched. The question is, will it? Yes.
Yeah. Last question. Sure.
Okay. My name is Heidi. I'm an intelligence analyst with the Department of State. And I'm curious you mentioned that you had conversations with all kinds of Indonesians and all kinds of Muslims, from moderates to extremists and in between. I'm just wondering, did you talk to them at all about Jemaah Islamiyah, and what were some of the attitudes towards this terrorist organization? It's my sense from sort of an outsider viewpoint that there still seems to be this sense in Indonesia, or a denial that Jemaah Islamiyah is a terrorist organization. And I'm just curious to see what kinds of comments that you got from the broad spectrum of folks that you talked with. about JI?
I think there was a reluctance. There was a reluctance at the beginning, right after Bali, to believe that Indonesians had been involved. There are all kinds of wild theories about. Norman's favorite theory was that a micronuclear device had been exploded, and that must be the work of some outside power, because the Indonesians weren't capable of that kind of explosive. So you had all these wild tabloid theories. That settled down pretty much by the time of my last reporting trip, and Indonesians really did come to sort of confront the issue that Indonesians had perpetrated the bombing. There was less, people were less convinced about the existence of Jemaah Islamiyah, and they were even less convinced about any ties between JI and groups like Al-Qaeda. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's pretty much where it stands now. And of course, Abu Bakr Bashir and other people, and I did talk to people who, well, were they JI, were they not JI? They claim that JI does not exist. It's a fiction made up by the West, Israel and the United States specifically. So I think Indonesians have slowly come on board to the important extent that they're now willing to actively participate in the police work that it takes to keep tabs on dangerous people, whether you really agree with how you categorize them or not. Does that answer your question?
Because I was wondering, because you were speaking with people sort of more in the general population. I mean, I deal with people who are officials, government officials, so of course they're going to be, yes, they're tracking terrorists, and of course but what I'm interested in is sort of more of the feeling among the general population, which is, I think, sort of more of the folks that you were meeting with and talking with, and what is that general sense sort of on the ground, and you did.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, like like our own country, when something happens, we're marvelously conspiratorial, and the media sort of whips these things up to a fine froth. But I think now there's a real recognition that there is a terrorist problem in Indonesia, and I think it's probably in perspective. People realize that it's not. I mean, Norman, when I called him up and said, hey, let's go on a second trip through Indonesia after 9/11, he said, well, it's going to be tough, but I don't want the world thinking that the Indonesians are a bunch of terrorists. And I think that that's sort of a common attitude too, that they really, they don't want the rest of the world thinking that. Yes, sir.
You said you went to the Spice Islands specifically. You were doing an article about nutmeg?
Well, I was doing an article for National Geographic about wither Indonesia, and would this country of Indonesia sort of bust into pieces now that the controlling authority, Suharto, was gone.
A couple of questions about that. One is did you actually eat the fruit of a nutmeg?
I had nutmeg dried, fried, sliced, diced, and they say it has kind of a hallucinogenic property to it. I did feel much more relaxed coming back on the ship than I did going, but that may have been the fact that there were no Islamic jihad on the ship.
And the other thing is most of the islands I'm familiar with that grow nutmeg in Indonesia are Christian, primarily. The population is. Now maybe, I don't know, that was maybe just the growers that I was dealing with happened to be Christian. So I was wondering, in the area where the cultivation of nutmeg is primarily, was the island you went to?
Well, the islands that we went to were called the Banda Islands. Mm-hmm. And I happened through the strange way that things can happen in Indonesia, and I talk about this in the book. I got on a plane with Norman flying from Jakarta to Makassar, and there was an older gentleman sitting in my seat. And you know how you're traveling and, you're road weary and maybe a little cranky. And so I had this guy evicted from my seat. And it turned out that he was the Sultan of the Banda Islands. And Norman kept coming up to me saying, "Psst, boss, boss." I said, "Norman, not now, not now. This guy's in my seat." Well, he was very cordial. When we got to the tarmac in Makassar, I apologized profusely. He said, no, no, Tracy, you must come and visit me in the Bandas. And so Norman and I, that was one of the reasons that we went into the Bandas. And Des Alwi, who is this person's name, and you can read about this in the book, he's Muslim. He was married, his wife was a Christian. The kids were raised Muslim. The population of the Bandas, I think, I may be wrong, but I think it's pretty equally split between Christians and Muslims. Now, when the Troubles happened, most of the Christians evacuated to safer islands, and Des brought in a warship from the Indonesian Navy to get everybody out. They all came to his hotel seeking refuge, and he stood in the alley behind the hotel with a shooting iron that one of Suharto's generals had given him, and said with his Islamic shawl and his prayer cap on, he's a Haji, you know, he's been to the Hajj, and stood there, you know, he said it was kind of like Clint Eastwood, Tracy, and stood there and said, over my dead body, you'll come, you know, nobody was going to come into this hotel and harm the Christians. So he managed to get them out. Now, the last time I spoke with them, the Christians were coming back into the Nutmeg Islands. Things were safer.
So can you make a direct connection between JI or whatever it is and nascent independence movements in the islands, and, you know, ones that are maybe moving to either, you know, completely move away from you know, Javanese sort of dominance to, you know, some either somewhat more federal type system or complete independence? It seems to me like there's probably a evolution from those independence movements to, you know, I guess the latest terrorist franchise. To say that you're now, you know, part of the greater Al-Qaeda franchise is to at least scare the hell out of your neighbors, if nothing else.
Well, I think a lot of these, I may be wrong, and there are Indonesian experts in the audience who I would be happily corrected by, but I think a lot of the separatist fervor has sort of died down now. I mean, when I went to Kalimantan and spent a night with the Dayak chieftains of West Kalimantan in a little shack on the roadside with a bare electric bulb, and they were drawing up their articles of separation, I think all of those kinds of things have sort of faded away now, and part of it was because of the passage of the local autonomy law in Indonesia and a change in the legal framework that would allow Indonesians to have more of a say. And of course, that was a big issue. You know, the Achenese, one of the reasons that the problem has remained a problem is that, you know, there are $1.2 billion worth of oil and gas that somehow never found, you know, their way, the money never found its way back to Aceh. It always found its way to pockets in Jakarta.
They're the Biafrans of the archipelago.
So I think there's relatively little connection between the two now.
Well, thank you, Tracy.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
I'm wondering whether you wrote the book under the influence of nutmeg.
No, sometimes I wish I had, but thank you for having me.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much.
And we won't be giving away the book, but the book is now for sale, and Tracy has kindly agreed to stay on and sign the copies of the book as well. So thank you all for coming, and come again to one of our events.
Thank you. So I'll exit this way. Oh, thank you. Thanks for the good question.
Tracy Dahlby is former managing editor for Newsweek International. His book, Allah's Torch, is published by HarperCollins. On the web at harpercollins.com. History, biography, and public affairs.